The factory ran nonstop, even at night. The night shift began like any other. The hum of the conveyor belt, the clatter of knives, the thick metallic scent of blood spreading through the air. The fluorescent light was dim and lifeless, casting long shadows on the walls. The massive hall seemed endless, cold, and empty, despite the fact that 5 people were working in it. Alex, the rookie, silently stood next to Jimmy, the mechanic. He was wearing a dirty apron that used to be white, and was laughing hoarsely while telling his funny stories. "You know, kid, the death rate is highest in factories like this," Jimmy said, pulling off a glove to reveal a scar on his arm. "One wrong move and you're ground up. Ha! Last year, during another shift, someone left their hand in the meat grinder." Something like that, anyway. Alex just flinched, unsure of how to respond. The sounds of the machines now seemed even louder, almost deafening. He glanced at the meat grinder. It was huge, dark, almost bottomless. The metal blades gleamed dully, and there was blood nearby, dried and mixing with fat. "Come on, grab your tools and get to work," Jimmy said, distracting him. Alex turned back to his task, but then a dull thud echoed. The machine stopped. Jimmy immediately frowned. "What the hell?" he muttered, walking toward the machine. "Probably just a sensor. These stupid chunks of meat always get stuck." Alex stepped back, watching as Jimmy opened the heavy metal cover. Inside, something was flickering, and it seemed like the meat grinder was still twitching, as though alive. "What's in there?" Alex asked, but Jimmy just waved him off without turning his head. He leaned in closer, trying to pull something from the depths. The machine was silent now, only the cold metal gleaming in the light. But Alex couldn't shake the feeling that this was the calm before the storm. Suddenly, the blades began to spin. They came to life sharply and without warning, like a predator waiting for the right moment. Jimmy didn't even have time to react. "Kid, help!" His voice choked with pain as the sleeve of his jacket was sucked into the machine. Alex froze, unable to move. His body was pierced with fear, as if his feet were glued to the floor. The machine pulled Jimmy in further, tearing muscles, breaking bones, and then the blades reached his torso. Jimmy's scream was so horrifying that it seemed like the very walls were vibrating. Blood flooded the floor, splattering for several meters, and small chunks of meat and bone flew in every direction. Then suddenly it all stopped. The machine fell silent. Where Jimmy had been, only a liquid mass remained, flowing down the conveyor belt. Alex closed his eyes, but the sounds lingered in his ears. He could feel the blood making the floor slick beneath his feet. Suddenly, a calm voice broke the silence. "You didn't even try to help him," Mr. Crane said. Alex looked up. Crane was standing next to him, as if he'd appeared from nowhere. His gaze was cold, and the corners of his lips curled ever so slightly into a semblance of a smile. This isn't my fault," Alex rasped. Crane tilted his head, as if pondering the rookie's words. "Of course not. Machines make mistakes from time to time. Or people do," he said, licking his dry lips. "But no big deal. Who knows how many more incidents like this there will be." Alex noticed a heavy repair wrench gleaming in Crane's hand, and somehow he felt like Crane was enjoying what had just happened. The air in the factory floor was thick with the smell of blood and metal. Everyone stood around, staring at the conveyor belt that had just ground their colleague into meat. No one could speak a word. Alex could feel every breath filling his lungs with a sticky, suffocating fear. Mr. Crane stood off to the side, as if studying their reactions. His expression was unervingly calm for such a situation, and when he spoke, his voice cut through the silence unexpectedly. "No one is going anywhere." What do you mean, no one is going anywhere?" One of the workers, Peter, blurted out, looking the most shaken. "We need to figure out what happened before anyone decides to call the police and accuse us of negligence. Imagine the headlines. Factory sells ground meat made from human flesh. You want that?" Crane spoke calmly, but his tone carried an iron authority. He clicked a key in his pocket, and everyone heard the heavy exit doors lock shut. The factory windows were small and high up. No one would be able to escape. But this isn't legal. Suzanne, one of the women in the shift, shouted. Crane narrowed his eyes and stepped closer to her. So close she instinctively took a step back. And what are you going to do, Suzanne? Call the police? What will you tell them? That you didn't press the button to start the machine? Do you think they'll believe you? Or maybe they'll blame us all. Suzanne clenched her hands, swallowing back tears, and silently lowered her head. Alex could feel his heart pounding in his chest like it was going to explode. He walked toward one of the exits and tried to open it, but the lock was too strong, and there were no tools or keys nearby. We can't stay here, he shouted. Crane turned and slowly walked over to him, like a predator approaching its prey. Alex, my boy, you want to leave? It's simple, help unload the trucks. If we don't, we're all out of jobs. And, he paused, smiling. Remember, the police are always looking for someone to blame. Alex realized they were trapped. The other workers slowly started to return to their tasks, too afraid to protest openly. But no one could think about anything other than what had happened to Jimmy. Someone stopped by the meat grinder when they noticed something shiny on the floor. It was Jimmy's glasses. They were lying in the middle of a pile of raw meat. There were still remnants of his flesh on the conveyor, and everyone realized that some of it had already been sent off in the trucks. It's in stores now, Peter whispered. Shut up, Crane barked. Alex suddenly felt the factory light seemed even dimmer. Somewhere deep in the building, a fan hummed, and the metallic corridors echoed with a loud ringing sound, as if someone else was there, among the conveyors and refrigerators watching them. Suzanne came up to Alex, whispering so quietly that her words were drowned out by the noise of the machines. Something's not right. Crane knew this was going to happen. Alex looked at her with suspicion, but she seemed genuinely terrified. We have to get out of here, she added. At that moment, Crane's voice cut through the noise. Everyone back to work. We'll finish this together. His words were a command, but his eyes revealed something else. Alex began to realize that their boss wasn't just cold-blooded. He was enjoying this. The air in the factory floor was heavy, thick with an invisible poison of fear. After Jimmy's death, no one could focus on their work. But Crane wouldn't let them relax. His voice came through too calmly, almost detached. You all know the drill. Work through the night. No exceptions. Time dragged on like syrup, and the night felt endless. Carla, a young, determined worker, had been sent down to the basement to fetch tools to fix the meat grinder. She hesitated, but the fear of their boss was stronger. She cast a brief glance at Alex, but he only shrugged. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Carla hadn't returned. Alex and another worker, Steve, decided to go after her. But Crane, standing at the stairs to the basement, stopped them. Stay put. She'll manage. It was only his cold, nearly dead gaze that held them back. But when strange sounds came from the basement, Alex couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed a flashlight and ran down. The stairs were slick with blood, seeping through every crack. Alex flicked on the light and saw Carla. Her body lay twisted on the floor, unnaturally contorted. Bruises marked her neck, as if she'd been strangled, but the panic frozen on her face spoke of a long, desperate struggle. Her arms were broken, and one leg was grotesquely bent. Alex wanted to scream, but instead, he froze. He heard footsteps on the stairs. Turning around, he saw Crane. His shirt was soaked in blood, and he held a heavy wrench. We all do our jobs, Alex, Crane said, leaning down to the body of Carla. He grabbed her by the hair and threw her onto a pile of raw meat. If someone doesn't follow the plan, they become part of the production. Alex felt his legs give way. He turned and sprinted back up the stairs, but the basement door slammed shut behind him with a thud. Get back to work, boy, Crane shouted from below. Meanwhile, Steve, who had stayed upstairs, nervously twirled a meat processing knife in his hands. He saw Alex go down, but he hadn't heard him return. The silence was heavier than any screams. Finally, Steve decided to act. He moved toward the basement door, but heavy footsteps approached from behind. Turning, he saw Crane. His face was calm, but his eyes burned. "You think you can hide from me?" he whispered before smashing Steve in the head with a hammer. Blood splattered across the walls, and Steve's body crumpled to the floor. Crane looked around at the rest of the workers, smiling. "Anyone else want to help Alex?" The workers were paralyzed by fear. Crane turned back toward the basement, dragging Steve's body behind him, leaving a long trail of blood. The freezer, which no one dared open, was now drenched in red. But in the darkness of the factory floor, no one believed they would make it until morning. The factory had become their prison, and Crane the executioner with no mercy. Alex, gripping the flashlight tightly in his hand, moved through the gloomy hallways of the factory. The entire place felt cold and hostile, every rustle or shadow making him jump. His body still trembled from the sight of Carla's mutilated body lying in the freezer. The bluish skin and shattered skull would stay in his mind for a long time. Crane, it seemed, reveled in their terror. Alex saw the gleam in his eyes when the boss stood by the freezer, a crooked smile on his face as he said, "Cold preserves better than a coffin." Now Alex knew there was only one way out: gather evidence and find a way to contact the police before he became the next victim. He found the factory's administrative block, which appeared abandoned. A thick layer of dust covered the shelves and desk, but the computer in the corner flickered with a red power indicator. Alex hesitated, fearing the noise might alert Crane, but he turned it on anyway. The monitor came to life, revealing dozens of folders. Alex skimmed through their names: archive, contracts, incidents. In the incidents folder were photos and reports. His fingers froze on the keyboard when he saw the first photo: a dismembered body of a worker. The report stated it was an accident. The more Alex opened, the more he understood. Similar incidents had been happening for years. People had gotten caught in crushers, meat grinders were found dead in refrigerators. And all of these incidents were written off as human error. Alex opened the video files. One of them showed Crane standing next to a woman repairing a conveyor belt. As she leaned in closer, Crane shoved her straight into the gear mechanism. Her scream quickly turned into the sound of crunching bones, and blood splattered across the camera lens. In another video, Crane was delivering a crazed monologue. "The factory isn't just a machine for processing cattle. It's a machine for processing weaklings. Those who survive earn my respect. The rest, well, they serve a greater purpose." Alex realized this was no accident. He opened a folder titled Expansion and saw blueprints for the factory's growth. According to the documents, the company had been receiving massive payouts from insurance claims related to worker fatalities. More deaths meant more money, which was reinvested into the factory's expansion. These deaths weren't accidents. They were a business model. At that moment, he heard footsteps. Alex grabbed a flash drive lying nearby and began copying the files, but the computer was too slow. The footsteps were getting closer. Crane appeared in the doorway, his smile more insane than ever. "Well, little detective, found something interesting?" Alex didn't answer. He grabbed a metal crowbar from the nearby table and hurled it toward Crane with all his might. Crane managed to dodge, but it gave Alex a few seconds to grab the flash drive and bolt into the hallway. Behind him, Crane's voice echoed, "You're not getting out of here, boy. The factory eats everyone. And you're no exception." When Alex reached the production floor, he paused for a moment, breathing heavily. In the middle of the room, on the meat processing table, lay Carla. Her body had been dismembered like an animal. Crane stood a few meters away, holding a large meat cleaver. "I've always wanted to know how much meat you can get from a person," he said, slowly approaching. Alex grabbed a chair and hurled it at Crane, then sprinted as fast as he could. Alex ran without looking back, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. His body was heavy, his legs barely able to hold him up. All he could hear were his ragged breaths and the distant sounds that were steadily getting closer. This wasn't just a hunt. It was a relentless, terrified chase where every step brought him closer to inevitable death. Crane, a psychopath, A maniac from whom there was no escape was on his tail. The avalanche of machine noises behind him, the screech of metal and the crunch of torn fabric, all created an atmosphere so thick that every step felt like it might be his last. Alex turned his head. Crane was right behind him. His face looked almost demonic in the pale shadow of the hunt. Dirty, with bloodstains on his clothes, his eyes burning with a painful gleam. "You won't escape." His voice was calm but filled with dangerous persistence, like a predatory beast. "You've been part of the system all these years, Alex. Now I'm coming for you." Alex, feeling that each breath was already pushing him to the limit, kept searching desperately for ways to flee. He ran through basements, metal doors, passing more and more dead bodies of his colleagues. At first, they were just traces, stains on the floor, then bodies torn to pieces, disfigured beyond recognition. Body parts scattered about, like grim reminders of the insignificant incidents that were supposed to occur in these places. Colleagues he once knew were now just meat for the grinder. When he reached the meat processing room, things got worse. The walls were covered in red stains, as if the factory itself had come to life with the blood that was on every step. The smell of decaying flesh made him gag, and the sounds he heard were more and more like a horrific symphony of death. Crane's animal-like laughter echoed with each step, a constant reminder of his inevitable demise. And then, near the old conveyor belt that moved relentlessly, Alex suddenly realized the only chance was to lure him. With every step that had led him here, he had observed Crane's behavior. This monster, who had long stalked his victims, was now following him with a deep, obsessive determination, unaware of the trap Alex had set. Alex made one last decisive move. He turned, quickly cut the conveyor line, and pulled the lever. The mechanism shuddered and slowed, then sped up again. Crane burst into the room, unable to stop in time. Suddenly, his feet caught on the stationary part of the conveyor. In an instant, he fell directly into the meat grinder, which began its merciless work. The horrifying sound of metal blades tearing through his body made Alex flinch. A brief image. Crane, struggling to escape, turning into a mass of minced meat. His scream faded in the machinery's noise, and then only the blood color filled the room. Alex stood, watching as blood flooded the floor, his hands trembling as his eyes met the reflections of the red liquid. The tissues mixed together, and the sounds reverberated in his head. In that moment, he felt calm, but only for a moment. His body continued to move through the heavy grind of the meat grinder, and that moment of satisfaction was tinged with horror. He had done it. He made it. But when Alex exited the factory through the dark, warped doors, his joy didn't last long. The police were already outside. They looked at him coldly, their faces stern and unwelcoming. One officer approached, pulling his arm back. "You're under arrest for murder. We suspect you're behind all the deaths at the factory," the officer said. Alex tried to speak, but he understood. Everything was already rigged. All the camera footage, all the fabricated documents, and even the testimonies, everything pointed to him as the main culprit. He had become part of the horrific machine that had been turning for so long. All those people who had once worked alongside him were now just links in a chain he couldn't break. The officer looked at him one more time, and in his eyes was the feeling of deep disappointment. "None of the factory workers expected this from you," he said, and then fell silent. Alex, with no hope for salvation, felt his world slowly falling apart. If you enjoyed this, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment on what you would have done in Alex's place. And remember, sometimes even the best strategy can backfire.